Some miracles don't knock. They arrive dragging hope across the pavement. At exactly 2:17 a.m., when Mercy Regional Hospital in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, had settled into the quiet rhythm that only night shifts understand, a tiny German Shepherd puppy appeared beneath the cold glow of the emergency room entrance. The security camera caught him first. Barely 8 weeks old, his sable coat was soaked from a light autumn drizzle, his oversized paws slipping against the polished concrete as he strained with every ounce of strength in his small body. Clenched tightly between his teeth was the torn handle of a black canvas bag nearly twice his size. Inch by inch, the puppy pulled it toward the automatic doors, stopping only long enough to catch his breath before tugging again with determined little jerks that seemed far too purposeful for a dog so young. Inside the hospital, fluorescent lights reflected softly across the nearly empty waiting room. A television mounted high in one corner played muted overnight news while the scent of fresh coffee drifted from the nurse's station. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker, a 36-year-old former U.S. Marine who now worked overnight security after leaving active duty, glanced up from his patrol log when he heard the faint scrape of fabric sliding across concrete. Years in uniform had trained him to notice sounds most people ignored. At first he assumed it was another delivery cart left outside by mistake. Then he looked toward the entrance and saw two amber eyes staring directly at him through the glass. The puppy didn't bark. He simply pulled harder. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical whisper. Cool night air rolled inside, carrying the scent of wet pine, asphalt, and distant mountain rain. The little shepherd stumbled across the threshold, exhausted but unwilling to release the black bag. Several nurses exchanged puzzled glances. One smiled, believing someone had abandoned an old gym bag beside a stray puppy. Another reached for the nearest phone to call animal control. Ethan quietly raised one hand. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Different. The puppy's breathing was fast, but his gaze never wandered. Every few seconds he looked from Ethan to the bag, then back again, as though repeating the same silent request. Please, follow me. Help. Ethan slowly crouched several feet away, careful not to frighten the trembling animal. The puppy's ears twitched forward. Instead of retreating, he dragged the bag another foot closer until it rested almost against Ethan's boots. The canvas was soaked, streaked with mud, and marked by tiny paw prints that told their own impossible story. Whatever journey had brought this little dog here had been long enough to wear the pads of his feet raw, yet he had never abandoned his burden. Ethan reached down carefully toward the frayed zipper, but before his fingers touched the bag, the puppy placed one small paw gently on top of it and looked up again with eyes carrying a fear far older than his age. Around them, conversations faded. The waiting room became strangely still. Even the television seemed unimportant. Somewhere outside, thunder rumbled softly beyond the dark silhouette of the Rockies. Ethan had trusted instincts in deserts half a world away. Those instincts had saved lives before, and as he looked into the puppy's unwavering eyes, he felt the same quiet certainty settle into his chest. Whatever waited inside that battered black bag was about to change every life in the room. Ethan did not reach for the zipper. Instead, he studied the puppy the way he had once studied military working dogs before every mission, searching for the smallest signs that separated panic from purpose. The little shepherd was trembling from exhaustion, yet his tail remained completely still. His breathing slowed the instant Ethan knelt beside him, as though he had finally found the person he had been searching for all night. Nurse Emily Carter stepped cautiously around the reception desk, a paper cup of water in one hand and a clean towel in the other. She smiled softly. Poor little guy must be freezing. She set the water a few inches away, but the puppy ignored it. He did not even glance toward the bowl. His amber eyes never left Ethan's face. That is strange, Emily whispered. He is not acting like a lost puppy. Ethan nodded without looking away. No, he came here for a reason. Another nurse suggested calling the county animal shelter before the night became any busier. A young medical resident wondered aloud whether someone nearby had abandoned the dog after an accident. The conversations floated around the room, but none of them seemed to reach the little shepherd. He shifted his weight, placed both front paws beside the worn canvas bag, and released one soft whine that barely rose above the hum of fluorescent lights. It was not the frightened cry of a puppy. It sounded patient, urgent. deliberate. Ethan slowly extended one open hand. The puppy leaned forward, sniffed his fingers for only a heartbeat, then gently nudged his wrist toward the bag. The gesture was so precise that Emily felt a chill despite the warm hospital lobby. "He wants you to open it," she murmured. Ethan finally wrapped 2 fingers around the rusted zipper. It resisted at first, stiff with dirt and moisture. As the metal teeth slowly separated, a faint earthy scent drifted into the air, mixed with damp leaves and cold rain. Inside lay no valuables, no clothing, and nothing anyone had expected. Resting neatly on top was a cracked cellular phone with a shattered screen. Beside it sat a leather wallet soaked through with water, a ring of keys attached to a tiny silver paw charm, and a folded infant blanket decorated with faded blue stars. Everything inside was carefully arranged, almost protected, as though someone had packed the bag in great haste, but with remarkable care. Emily picked up the blanket first. "It is still warm," she said quietly, surprise filling her voice. Ethan looked at the broken phone. The battery indicator flashed once before the screen faded black again. He pressed the power button, but nothing happened. The puppy suddenly stood, ears straight, every muscle tightening beneath his damp coat. He looked toward the entrance doors, then back at Ethan. One sharp bark echoed through the waiting room. Before anyone could react, he grabbed the torn handle once more and began pulling the bag toward the exit. Halfway to the doors, he stopped and looked back. His eyes were pleading now, brighter than before, filled with a desperate certainty that words could never carry. Ethan felt the familiar weight of instinct settle across his shoulders. It was the same feeling he had trusted countless times during deployments overseas, the quiet voice that appeared before facts ever did. He rose to his feet without hesitation, picked up the black bag, and followed. Behind him, Emily reached for her jacket. "If you are going," she said, already walking after him, "I am coming too." Outside, the drizzle had grown steadier, washing the empty parking lot beneath pale streetlights. The puppy trotted several yards ahead before stopping once more, making certain they were still behind him, then turned toward the dark tree line beyond the hospital grounds, where the night seemed to be waiting in complete silence. The rain softened into a fine mist that floated beneath the streetlights like silver dust, blurring the edges of the empty parking lot. Scout moved with surprising confidence for such a young puppy, trotting several yards ahead before stopping to glance back at Ethan and Emily, making certain they had not turned around. Every time their eyes met, the puppy continued forward without hesitation, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Ethan carried the black canvas bag over one shoulder, while Emily held a flashlight she had borrowed from the emergency department. Beyond the hospital property, a narrow maintenance trail disappeared into a grove of towering ponderosa pines. The scent of wet earth, cedar needles, and fresh rain filled the cool mountain air. Nothing stirred except the occasional whisper of branches swaying overhead. How far could a puppy like this have come? Emily asked quietly. Ethan looked down at the tiny muddy paw prints scattered across the gravel path. Farther than anyone would expect when someone matters enough. Scout reached the edge of the woods and paused beside an old wooden post where the trail divided into 2 directions. Instead of choosing immediately, he lowered his nose close to the ground, circling once before turning sharply toward the eastern path. His movements were focused, almost practiced, and Ethan felt a familiar respect growing inside him. He had seen military dogs track wounded Marines through conditions that left even experienced soldiers disoriented. This little shepherd carried that same unwavering determination, although no one could explain how. Several minutes passed in silence, except for the gentle rhythm of their footsteps and the distant rumble of thunder rolling through the mountains. The flashlight beam swept across fallen branches, moss-covered stones, and patches of wild grass sparkling with rainwater. Suddenly, Scout stopped so abruptly that Ethan nearly walked into him. The puppy stood completely still, ears raised high, staring toward a cluster of dense shrubs ahead. Then he released a soft whimper unlike any sound he had made before. It was not fear. It was recognition. Ethan slowly approached, careful with every step. Hidden beneath the branches lay a faded blue backpack, partially covered with leaves. Emily knelt beside it and brushed away the debris. The zipper hung open. Inside were several baby bottles, unopened diapers, a small package of baby wipes, and a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. Everything inside was damp but neatly packed. Emily looked up, confusion filling her face. Someone was traveling with an infant. Ethan noticed something else resting inside the front pocket. A folded road map with one location circled in red ink. Mercy Regional Hospital. No other notes. No directions. Only the hospital where they had started. Scout gently nudged the backpack with his nose, but did not stop there. He looked back at Ethan again, then continued farther into the woods. The trail narrowed until it became little more than a ribbon of mud weaving between towering pines. Rain collected on evergreen branches and fell in slow drops that echoed through the quiet forest. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Every clue they found answered one question while creating two more. Why had someone packed supplies for a baby? Why had the hospital been marked on the map? And why had a puppy become the only guide leading anyone toward the truth? Nearly half a mile from the emergency room, Scout suddenly broke into a faster run before stopping beside a massive fallen cottonwood tree. He barked once, then twice, the sharp sound cutting cleanly through the forest. Ethan raised the flashlight, its beams sliding beneath the tangled branches. At first he saw only rain-soaked leaves and broken limbs. Then a faint reflection caught his eye. A silver bracelet glimmered softly beneath the fallen tree, followed by the unmistakable outline of a human hand resting motionless against the wet forest floor. Emily covered her mouth as Scout hurried forward, gently pressing his small body against the outstretched hand with the quiet tenderness of someone who had refused to give up. For one suspended moment, no one moved. Rain gathered on the fallen cottonwood, dripping steadily onto the soaked leaves below, each drop sounding louder than the last in the midnight silence. Ethan stepped carefully over the thick roots and knelt beside the outstretched hand. It was cold from the mountain air, but not lifeless. He gently placed 2 fingers against the woman's wrist, holding his breath. Then he felt it. A faint, fragile pulse. Weak, but unmistakably there. "She is alive," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Emily was already reaching for the emergency radio clipped to her jacket. Her hands trembled as she called the hospital, requesting a rescue team and an ambulance to the maintenance trail east of Mercy Regional. While she spoke, Ethan swept the flashlight across the surrounding area. The young woman appeared to be in her late 20s, dressed in a rain-soaked hiking jacket, her face pale with exhaustion rather than injury. One arm remained wrapped protectively around a small bundle tucked safely beneath the shelter of the fallen tree. Ethan carefully pulled back the edge of the damp blanket. A tiny infant slept quietly inside, cheeks warm, breathing peacefully, completely unaware of the long night that had unfolded around them. Emily lowered the radio slowly, tears filling her eyes. "The baby is all right," she whispered, almost unable to believe it. Scout released the first relaxed breath anyone had heard from him since arriving at the hospital. His rigid posture softened as he curled beside the infant, gently resting his chin on the edge of the blanket as though standing guard until help arrived. Ethan removed his own waterproof field jacket and spread it carefully over the young mother and child to shield them from the rain. He noticed the silver bracelet around her wrist more clearly now. A small engraved charm caught the flashlight beam. On one side was the outline of a German Shepherd puppy. On the other were 3 simple words. "Kindness comes home." Something about the phrase lingered in Ethan's thoughts, though he could not explain why. A distant siren finally echoed through the trees, growing louder with every passing second. Blue and white emergency lights soon shimmered between the trunks like stars moving through the forest. Paramedics hurried toward the scene carrying medical equipment, but even they slowed when they saw the little shepherd refusing to leave the woman's side. One medic smiled gently. "Looks like this fellow has been taking care of everyone before we got here." Scout stood, wagging his tail only once, then stepped aside as though his mission had always been to bring them to this exact moment. The rescue team carefully placed both mother and infant on separate stretchers, confirming that each was breathing steadily. One of the paramedics examined the black canvas bag Ethan had carried from the hospital. "Good thing this made it back," she said while checking the contents. "Identification, emergency contacts, and the baby's medical records are all inside." Ethan looked at Scout with quiet admiration. The puppy had not dragged random belongings through the rain. Somehow he had known exactly what needed to reach the hospital first. As the ambulance doors closed, the young mother stirred for the first time. Her eyes opened only slightly, clouded with fatigue, yet they searched the crowd until they found the small German shepherd waiting beside Ethan. A gentle smile touched her face. Barely above a whisper, she managed to speak a single word. "Scout." The puppy's ears lifted instantly. His tail began wagging with pure relief, and for the first time that night, everyone understood that this was never the story of a stray dog searching for strangers. It was the story of a faithful friend who had simply refused to let the only family he knew disappear into the darkness. The ambulance raced through the sleeping streets of Cedar Ridge with its lights reflecting across rain-soaked storefronts and empty intersections. Inside, every movement was measured, every voice calm, every second valuable. Emily remained beside the young mother, quietly monitoring her while another medic checked the infant, who continued sleeping peacefully beneath a warm blanket as though untouched by the long night outside. Ethan sat near the rear doors, holding the black canvas bag securely across his lap. Scout rested at his feet, his damp fur finally beginning to dry beneath the gentle warmth of the ambulance heater. Even now, the little German shepherd refused to close his eyes. Every few moments he lifted his head to look toward the stretcher, making certain the woman was still there. Ethan reached down and slowly rubbed behind the puppy's ears. Scout leaned into the touch for only a second before returning his attention to the woman. Loyalty, Ethan realized, was not something this puppy had learned. It was simply who he was. As the ambulance arrived at Mercy Regional Hospital, the emergency team was already waiting beneath the bright entrance lights. Stretchers rolled smoothly across the pavement as nurses guided the mother and infant through the automatic doors. Doctors quickly surrounded them, speaking in calm voices while beginning careful examinations. Scout started forward immediately, but a nurse gently stopped him before he entered the treatment area. The puppy sat without resistance, his eyes fixed on the hallway where the woman had disappeared. Ethan remained beside him. Neither of them seemed willing to leave. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Rain continued tapping softly against the large waiting room windows while the coffee machine hummed quietly in the corner. Emily emerged from the treatment room, carrying the infant, now wrapped in a fresh hospital blanket decorated with tiny yellow stars. The baby had awakened and stared curiously around the brightly lit hallway with wide blue eyes. Ethan smiled for the first time that night. Scout stood carefully and stepped closer, lowering his nose just enough to sniff the baby's tiny hand. Instead of pulling away, the infant's fingers gently wrapped around one tuft of the puppy's fur. The waiting room grew unexpectedly silent. Several nurses paused their work simply to watch the moment unfold. "Looks like they already know each other," one whispered with a smile. Emily nodded. Sometimes the smallest friendships are the strongest ones. A physician soon approached Ethan carrying the leather wallet recovered from the black bag. "We were able to identify her," he said. "Her name is Hannah Brooks, 28 years old. She works as a veterinary technician about 20 miles from here." Ethan accepted the wallet and carefully opened it. Inside, behind her driver's license, sat a slightly faded photograph. Hannah smiled brightly beside a much smaller version of Scout, who could not have been more than a few weeks old. The puppy was wrapped inside an old blue towel, while Hannah held a bottle in one hand and laughed directly at the camera. On the back of the picture, written in neat blue ink, were the words, "Every life deserves someone who refuses to walk away." Ethan quietly closed the wallet. He looked down at Scout, who was still sitting patiently outside the treatment room, never asking for food, never asking for comfort, only waiting. At that moment, the emergency physician returned, his expression noticeably lighter than before. "She is awake," he said softly. "She asked one question before anything else." Ethan looked up. "What did she ask?" The doctor smiled. "She wanted to know if her little hero made it back safely." Scout's ears lifted instantly, as though he had understood every word, and his tail began sweeping gently across the polished hospital floor while, somewhere beyond the closed doors, Hannah whispered his name once more with quiet gratitude. Morning arrived slowly over Cedar Ridge, washing the hospital windows with soft golden light that melted away the long shadows of the night. The rain had stopped, leaving tiny drops clinging to the maple trees outside like scattered pieces of glass. Inside Mercy Regional Hospital, the atmosphere had changed. Nurses smiled more easily. The overnight tension had given way to quiet relief. although one small German shepherd still refused to leave his place outside Hannah Brooks's room. Scout had fallen asleep only once, and even then it lasted no more than a few minutes before he lifted his head at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Ethan remained nearby, sitting with a paper cup of coffee that had long since turned cold. He had planned to finish his shift hours earlier, yet something inside him would not let him walk away. Around 8 o'clock, Dr. Melissa Grant stepped into the waiting area carrying a patient chart and an expression that balanced exhaustion with hope. "She is doing much better," she said, smiling at both Ethan and Emily. "She is asking to see the puppy." Scout was already standing before the sentence had finished. His ears pointed forward, his tail moving carefully, almost cautiously, as though he could hardly believe the words were real. Dr. Grant opened the door only halfway. "Come on, little guy." Scout entered quietly. No barking, no jumping, no excitement beyond what his gently wagging tail could contain. Hannah lay comfortably against the raised hospital bed, looking tired but peaceful. The infant slept safely in a bassinet beside her, wrapped in fresh blankets beneath the warm morning light. As soon as Scout reached the bedside, Hannah stretched out her hand. The puppy immediately rested his head beneath her fingers and closed his eyes. Neither of them moved for several long seconds. The room became wonderfully still. Emily watched from the doorway, quietly wiping away tears before anyone noticed. Hannah finally smiled. "You found them," she whispered. "I knew you would." Ethan stepped inside carrying the black canvas bag. "He never let it out of his sight," he said. Hannah looked toward the weathered bag and nodded softly. Everything our daughter needed was inside. Her records, our identification, emergency contacts. I packed it before we started hiking yesterday. She paused to gather her thoughts. The storm came in much faster than the forecast predicted. A tree blocked the trail, and my phone broke when I tried calling for help. I knew no one would find us before morning. Her eyes returned to Scout. So I gave him the bag and told him to go to the place where kind people always help. Ethan looked at the puppy in quiet amazement. "You told an 8-week-old puppy to find a hospital?" Hannah smiled with gentle certainty. "Not exactly. I taught him from the day I rescued him that every trip to the veterinarian ended where people healed animals. During our walks, I always let him see this hospital because it shares the same parking entrance. I never imagined he remembered. I only hoped." Scout lifted his head and gazed at Hannah with complete trust, as though none of what had happened felt extraordinary to him. For him, there had been only one simple choice. Someone he loved needed help, so he kept walking until he found it. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, remembering years spent believing courage belonged only to those who wore uniforms. Sitting beside that tiny German shepherd, he quietly realized courage could also come wrapped in muddy fur, carried on 4 tired paws, and measured not by strength, but by an unwillingness to give up on someone who could no longer walk beside you. The rest of the day passed with the quiet rhythm that only hospitals seem to understand, where hope and worry shared the same hallways without ever speaking to one another. Warm afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished floors, replacing the cold reflections of the storm with a gentle glow that reached every corner of the pediatric wing. Hannah regained more of her strength with each passing hour, and every nurse who entered her room left smiling after finding Scout faithfully stationed beside her bed or quietly checking on the sleeping baby. Word of the little German shepherd had spread through the building faster than any official report. Doctors who had not worked the overnight shift found reasons to walk past Hannah's room, hoping to catch a glimpse of the tiny puppy who had somehow accomplished what no emergency beacon, no broken telephone, and no passing hiker had managed to do. Scout accepted every kind glance with quiet humility, wagging his tail whenever someone greeted him, but never wandering far from the family he had protected. Ethan found himself returning to the room several times, although his shift had ended hours before. He told himself he was only checking on hospital security, yet deep down he understood the truth. Since leaving the Marines, he had spent years drifting from one routine to another, convincing himself that keeping his head down was enough. Watching Scout reminded him that purpose was not something people retired from. Sometimes it simply arrived when they least expected it. Late that afternoon, Hannah asked Ethan to pull a chair closer to her bedside. She reached inside the black canvas bag once more and removed a small folded envelope that had remained untouched through the long night. "I almost forgot this was inside," she said softly. The paper was slightly wrinkled, but still sealed. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were only 3 words. If found first. Hannah slowly opened it. Inside rested a handwritten letter beside a veterinary clinic identification badge. Emily quietly stepped into the room just as Hannah began reading aloud. The letter explained that Scout had been discovered abandoned several weeks earlier outside the clinic where Hannah worked. He had been frightened, hungry, and too weak to stand for very long. Most people believed he would never become a working dog because he was so young and unusually gentle. Hannah had ignored every prediction. She fed him by hand, carried him to work every morning, and introduced him to every frightened animal that entered the clinic. Instead of hiding behind her legs, Scout always approached first, sitting quietly beside nervous dogs until they stopped shaking. Hannah smiled through grateful tears. He never knew he was supposed to be brave, she whispered. He only knew someone needed him. Ethan looked at the puppy lying peacefully near the bassinet. Scout had fallen asleep with one paw resting lightly against the baby's blanket, as though even in his dreams he refused to stop protecting her. Dr. Melissa Grant entered carrying discharge paperwork for the infant. "Your daughter is healthy," she said warmly. "She can go home as soon as you are ready in another day or 2. Relief filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Hannah closed her eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer without speaking a word. Ethan quietly glanced toward the window where evening light painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and blue. For the first time in years, he found himself believing that not every rescue happened on a battlefield. Some happened in ordinary places, led by the smallest guide imaginable, proving that faith sometimes arrived without speeches, without medals, and without anyone expecting to witness a miracle carried gently on 4 muddy paws. That evening the hospital settled into a peaceful hush, the kind that arrived only after the busiest hours had faded and families finally allowed themselves to breathe again. Outside, the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the Rocky Mountains, leaving the sky painted in deep shades of blue and silver. Inside Hannah's room, the soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated the bassinet, where her daughter slept with one tiny hand resting above the blanket. Scout lay curled beneath the bassinet, breathing slowly, his ears still lifting at every unfamiliar sound in the hallway before relaxing again. Ethan stood near the window, preparing to leave for the first time since the night before. He had already picked up his jacket when Dr. Melissa Grant entered carrying a small folder. Her smile was gentle, but something in her expression told Ethan the conversation was not over yet. "We reviewed Hannah's admission records," she said quietly. "There is something all of you should probably see." Hannah accepted the folder with curious eyes. Inside was a printed copy of the hospital's overnight security footage. Dr. Grant pointed to the first timestamp. The monitor showed Scout arriving at the emergency entrance, struggling with the heavy black canvas bag exactly as everyone remembered. Another image appeared only 3 minutes later. It showed the puppy reaching the automatic doors while pausing several times to look back toward the darkness beyond the parking lot. Hannah studied the picture in silence. "He kept checking to see if I was following," she whispered. Dr. Grant nodded. "That is what we thought at first." She turned to the final still frame. The camera positioned near the eastern entrance had captured something no one had noticed during the confusion of the night. Before Scout pulled the bag through the doors, he had carefully nudged a small object beneath the front bench outside the emergency room. During the morning cleanup, one of the maintenance workers discovered it. Dr. Grant reached into her pocket and placed the object on Hannah's blanket. It was a faded blue puppy collar, still slightly damp from the rain, with a tiny brass tag hanging from the buckle. Hannah picked it up slowly, her fingers trembling. The front of the tag carried Scout's name. The back held a single engraved sentence. "If I am ever lost, please help me find my family." Emily quietly covered her mouth. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The puppy had removed his own collar before dragging the bag inside, leaving behind the one thing that identified him. Almost as if, in that desperate moment, his own safety no longer mattered. Only Hannah and the baby did. Scout opened his eyes at the familiar sound of his name. He stood, stretched, and walked over to Hannah, gently touching the old collar with his nose before looking up at her face. Hannah smiled through grateful tears and slipped the tiny collar back around his neck. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. The brass tag caught the warm light from the bedside lamp, shining softly against his sable fur. Ethan had witnessed acts of courage that earned medals, ceremonies, and newspaper headlines. Yet somehow this simple gesture from an 8-week-old puppy felt even greater. No applause had guided him. No orders had sent him into the storm. Love alone had been enough. As the room fell quiet once more, Scout rested beside the bassinet again, closing his eyes with complete peace, unaware that everyone around him had just learned the truest measure of devotion was not found in extraordinary strength, but in the quiet willingness to give away even your own identity if it meant the people you loved would find their way home. The following morning arrived with crisp mountain air drifting through the slightly opened hospital windows, carrying the clean scent of pine after the storm. Sunlight poured into Hannah's room, painting warm patterns across the blanket where her daughter slept peacefully. For the first time since that unforgettable night, laughter quietly replaced worry. Nurses stopped by simply to wave at Scout, and every visitor seemed to leave smiling after the tiny German shepherd greeted them with gentle eyes and a slowly wagging tail. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching the little family with a feeling he had almost forgotten. It was not excitement. It was peace. The kind that settled deep inside a person after believing for too long that life only took things away. Dr. Melissa Grant entered carrying a small gift bag tied with a blue ribbon. "The staff wanted to do something," she said. "It is not much, but everyone insisted." Hannah opened the bag carefully. Inside rested a soft fleece blanket for the baby, a new chew toy for Scout, and dozens of handwritten notes from hospital employees. Some thanked the puppy for reminding them why they chose medicine. Others simply wrote, "Thank you for bringing hope through our doors." Hannah quietly read every card before folding them together with careful hands. Scout sniffed the blue chew toy for a moment, then gently pushed it toward the baby's bassinet instead of keeping it for himself. Emily laughed softly. Even his presence belonged to someone else. Ethan shook his head with an amused smile. "He is consistent." A volunteer photographer from the hospital foundation stopped by later that afternoon after hearing the remarkable story from the overnight staff. She politely asked whether Hannah would allow one photograph to be placed on the hospital's community wall, where stories of courage and gratitude were displayed for patients and families. Hannah agreed. The photographer positioned everyone near the large window overlooking the mountains. Ethan stood beside Hannah. Emily cradled the baby, and Scout sat proudly between them with his newly returned blue collar shining beneath the afternoon sun. Just before the camera clicked, Scout unexpectedly stood and walked across the room. Instead of facing the lens, he quietly rested against Ethan's leg and looked up at him. The photographer lowered her camera for a moment. "I think he already chose where he belongs," she whispered. Ethan looked down, surprised by the unexpected weight of the puppy leaning gently against him. He scratched behind Scout's ears, and the little shepherd answered with a contented sigh that sounded almost like complete trust. Hannah noticed the moment and smiled knowingly. "He remembers everyone who helps him," she said. "Animals do not always measure love by time. Sometimes they measure it by who stays." Those words lingered in Ethan's heart long after the photograph had finally been taken. He had spent years believing that every meaningful chapter of his life ended the day he folded away his Marine uniform. Yet standing beside a hospital window with a rescued family and an extraordinary puppy, he began to wonder whether some callings simply changed their appearance instead of disappearing. Before leaving the room, Hannah reached for Ethan's hand. "When we go home tomorrow," she said quietly, "would you visit us sometime?" Ethan smiled. "I would like that." Scout looked from Hannah to Ethan, his tail sweeping happily across the polished floor as though the answer had already been decided long before anyone asked the question. Outside the window, the storm clouds had completely disappeared, revealing an endless Colorado sky where fresh sunlight touched every mountain peak, quietly reminding anyone willing to notice that after the darkest nights, hope rarely arrived all at once. More often, it came one faithful step at a time. The next afternoon arrived with the kind of calm that made the previous night feel almost impossible to believe. Mercy Regional Hospital seemed brighter than Ethan had ever remembered. Sunlight spilled across the lobby, fresh flowers decorated the reception desk, and the familiar scent of brewed coffee blended with the clean fragrance of freshly polished floors. Hannah had been officially cleared to leave the hospital. Nurses gathered quietly near the entrance, not because hospital policy required it, but because everyone wanted to say goodbye to the remarkable little family that had somehow reminded an entire building why compassion mattered. Scout trotted happily beside Hannah's wheelchair, occasionally looking back to check on the baby sleeping peacefully in her carrier. Every few feet someone knelt to scratch behind his ears or whisper a grateful thank you. He accepted every gesture with the same gentle humility that had carried him through the storm. Before reaching the front doors, Hannah stopped beside the community wall where framed photographs of patients, volunteers, and hospital staff lined the hallway. The volunteer photographer had already placed their picture among them. Beneath the photograph was a simple plaque that read, "Sometimes hope arrives on 4 small paws." Visitors paused to study the image, smiling without knowing the entire story behind it. Hannah looked at the photograph for several quiet seconds before turning toward Ethan. "Would you help me with something?" she asked. Ethan nodded immediately. Hannah reached into the diaper bag and removed the old blue towel from the photograph inside her wallet. Time had faded its color, and one corner had been neatly stitched by hand. "This was the towel I wrapped Scout in the day I found him behind the clinic," she said. "He was so tiny that he fit in both of my hands." She folded the towel once more before offering it to Ethan. "I want you to keep it." Ethan looked surprised. "This belongs to you." Hannah smiled gently and shook her head. "No, memories belong wherever they keep growing." Ethan accepted the worn towel with both hands, feeling the softness of the fabric and the quiet weight of everything it represented. Scout stepped forward, sniffed the familiar cloth, then rested his head briefly against Ethan's knee before returning to Hannah's side. It was almost as though the puppy approved of the exchange. Emily watched the moment with glistening eyes. "I have worked here for 12 years, she said softly. "I have seen incredible recoveries, joyful reunions, and heartbreaking losses. But I have never seen trust passed from one heart to another so quietly." Just then a small boy waiting with his grandfather for an afternoon appointment approached Scout, holding a tennis ball that looked nearly worn out from years of play. "Your dog can have this," the boy said shyly. "He looks like a hero." Scout accepted the ball gently, wagged his tail once, then carried it straight to the baby's carrier and placed it beside the blanket before sitting down again. Laughter spread through the lobby. Even the grandfather smiled and whispered, "He still thinks of her first." Hannah looked at Ethan with peaceful certainty. That is exactly who he is. As the automatic doors opened, a cool Colorado breeze drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine and distant wildflowers. Hannah paused before leaving the hospital grounds. She turned back one final time, not to admire the building, but to look at the people standing together inside its entrance. Doctors, nurses, custodians, receptionists, volunteers, and one former Marine had all become part of a story none of them had expected to live. Scout sat beside her, lifting his face toward the afternoon sun, unaware that the greatest thing he had rescued was no longer only a family. Without ever intending to, he had quietly restored hope in hearts that had almost forgotten how deeply simple kindness could change a life. 3 months passed, and autumn quietly surrendered to the first gentle hints of winter. Cedar Ridge woke each morning beneath pale sunlight that settled over the mountains like a soft blanket, while the pine forests surrounding the town stood silent beneath crisp blue skies. Life had returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet for everyone whose path had crossed that unforgettable night, ordinary no longer felt quite the same. Hannah was back at the veterinary clinic, caring for frightened animals with the same patient hands that had once rescued a tiny German shepherd from behind a dumpster. Her daughter, Grace, had grown into a cheerful baby whose laughter filled every room she entered. Scout was no longer the clumsy puppy who struggled to drag a canvas bag across wet pavement. He had grown taller, stronger, and more confident, though his gentle spirit had never changed. Every morning before Hannah left for work, Scout carefully walked beside the stroller as if protecting the most precious assignment he had ever received. Ethan visited often, far more often than he ever admitted to himself. At first he always found practical excuses. A security question, a package that needed delivering, fresh dog treats from the pet supply store across town. Eventually Hannah stopped pretending to believe those reasons. "You know," she said one chilly Saturday while pouring fresh coffee onto the porch overlooking the mountains, "Grace smiles before she even sees you. She hears your truck." Ethan laughed quietly. "I guess I have become predictable." Scout, lying comfortably near the front steps, lifted his head at the familiar sound of Ethan's voice before walking over and placing one large paw against his boot. It had become their silent greeting. No barking, no excitement, just quiet recognition between two souls who had walked through the same storm. After breakfast, Hannah surprised Ethan with a small wooden box she had discovered while organizing old family belongings. Inside rested a silver Marine Challenge coin that had belonged to her late father, who had served decades earlier before becoming a volunteer firefighter in their hometown. The edges were worn smooth from years of being carried in a pocket. One side displayed the eagle, globe, and anchor. The other carried a simple inscription: "Service never truly ends." Ethan stared at the coin without speaking. His fingers traced the engraved words again and again. For years he had believed that leaving military service meant leaving behind the only meaningful purpose he had ever known. Yet sitting on a quiet porch beside a rescued family, with Scout resting peacefully at his feet and Grace laughing as autumn leaves drifted through the yard, he finally understood what Hannah's father had meant. Service was never limited to a uniform. Sometimes it looked like opening a hospital door. Sometimes it looked like staying beside someone who felt alone. Sometimes it looked like raising a child surrounded by kindness. And sometimes it looked like a German shepherd who never once questioned whether another soul deserved saving. Before Ethan left that afternoon, Grace reached from her stroller toward him with tiny outstretched fingers. Scout gently nudged Ethan's hand forward until he accepted hers. Hannah smiled as she watched the simple exchange. "Looks like you are family now," she said softly. Ethan glanced toward the mountains glowing beneath the setting sun, then back at the little girl, the faithful dog, and the peaceful home standing before him. For the first time in many years, the word family no longer reminded him of what he had lost. It reminded him of what quiet acts of mercy had unexpectedly given back. Winter arrived quietly in Cedar Ridge, covering rooftops, fences, and pine branches with a blanket of fresh snow that softened every sound. The mountains stood beneath a brilliant blue sky, untouched and timeless, while the small town prepared for its annual Christmas gathering in the park beside Mercy Regional Hospital. Families filled the sidewalks carrying cups of hot chocolate. Children laughed as they built snowmen, and strings of warm white lights stretched from tree to tree, turning the afternoon into something that felt almost magical. Hannah bundled Grace into a thick red coat and wool hat before lifting her into the stroller. Scout, now nearly full-grown, walked proudly beside them wearing a simple blue bandana that Emily had sewn by hand with tiny embroidered paw prints along the edge. Ethan met them outside the hospital entrance, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. He had traded his security uniform for a heavy brown jacket, but the silver Marine Challenge coin Hannah had given him remained safely inside his pocket every single day. They wandered slowly through the festival together, stopping as neighbors greeted Scout like an old friend. Some recognized him from the photograph hanging inside the hospital. Others only knew him as the gentle dog who somehow made frightened children smile whenever he walked by. At one booth, volunteers invited visitors to write messages of gratitude on wooden ornaments that would later decorate a community tree inside the hospital lobby. Hannah handed Ethan a blank ornament without saying a word. He stared at the smooth piece of wood for several moments before picking up the marker. He thought about medals, missions, and years spent believing courage belonged only to extraordinary moments. Then he quietly wrote 6 simple words. "Kindness always finds its way home." Hannah smiled as she hung the ornament on a nearby evergreen branch. Emily added one of her own beside it. Dr. Melissa Grant placed another just below theirs. Before long, the tree shimmered beneath hundreds of handwritten reminders that hope often lived in ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary compassion. As evening settled over the town, the mayor stepped onto the small stage to thank hospital staff, volunteers, first responders, and every neighbor who had helped others throughout the year. Near the end of his remarks, he invited one unexpected guest forward. Hannah gently unclipped Scout's leash. The German shepherd walked calmly across the snow until he reached the center of the stage. There were no loud cheers at first, only quiet applause that slowly grew stronger as people recognized the humble little hero whose story had already become part of the town's memory. Scout simply sat beneath the glowing Christmas lights, tilting his head slightly as though wondering why everyone had stopped talking. Grace laughed from her stroller and clapped her tiny hands. Scout immediately left the stage, trotting back through the crowd to sit beside her once again. The applause became even warmer. Ethan smiled to himself. That single choice somehow explained everything. Scout had never cared about recognition. His place had always been beside the people he loved. Snowflakes drifted gently through the evening air as the hospital lights glowed behind them, reflecting softly against the peaceful white landscape. Ethan looked around at Hannah, Grace, Emily, Dr. Grant, the neighbors filling the park, and the faithful German shepherd resting quietly in the snow. He realized that miracles rarely announced themselves with grand speeches or impossible signs. More often, they arrived disguised as small decisions made with faithful hearts. One step, one act of mercy, one soul refusing to leave another behind. And sometimes, that was more than enough to change an entire community forever. Spring returned to Cedar Ridge with quiet confidence, melting the last patches of snow into clear streams that wound through the foothills beneath the Rocky Mountains. Wildflowers slowly reclaimed the meadows, birds filled the morning air with familiar songs, and the pine trees carried once again the clean scent of new beginnings. Nearly a year had passed since the night a tiny German shepherd had refused to surrender to fear, and yet the echoes of that journey remained woven into everyday life. Mercy Regional Hospital had placed a simple wooden bench beneath the maple tree outside the emergency entrance, facing the very doors where one extraordinary story had quietly begun. A small bronze plaque rested beneath the seat. It did not mention miracles or heroes. It simply read, "In honor of every heart that chooses compassion before certainty." People often sat there without knowing why the place felt peaceful. Nurses paused there after difficult shifts. Families waited there before welcoming loved ones home. Children climbed onto the bench to pet Scout whenever Hannah brought him to visit the hospital. Grace had learned to take her first steady steps by holding on to Scout's thick fur while he walked with remarkable patience, matching every tiny movement without ever pulling ahead. Ethan visited almost every weekend. He no longer came because he felt responsible. He came because he belonged. Sometimes he and Hannah shared coffee, while Grace chased butterflies across the grass. Sometimes they said almost nothing at all, listening instead to the wind moving gently through the trees. Scout usually rested nearby, lifting his head only when Grace wandered a little too far before calmly following behind her like the quiet guardian he had always been. One warm afternoon, Ethan noticed an elderly man sitting alone on the wooden bench outside the emergency entrance. The man stared silently toward the parking lot with tired eyes, holding a folded hospital bracelet in one weathered hand. Without hesitation, Scout walked over and quietly sat beside him. He did not bark. He did not ask for attention. He simply leaned gently against the man's leg. After a long moment, the stranger smiled through tearful eyes and rested one trembling hand on Scout's head. Ethan watched from a distance, remembering the first night he had seen those same amber eyes through the hospital doors. Nothing about Scout had changed. He still found the people who needed him most. He still believed every lonely heart deserved company. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the Colorado sky, Hannah gathered Grace into her arms while Ethan clipped Scout's leash for the walk home. The four of them followed the quiet sidewalk beneath rows of blooming maple trees, their shadows stretching together across the pavement until it became impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Behind them, the emergency room doors opened and closed as they always had, welcoming strangers carrying burdens no one else could see. Ahead of them, another ordinary evening waited, filled with laughter, shared meals, and the peaceful comfort of knowing everyone had made it home. Perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Not that a puppy had found a hospital, not that strangers had become family, but that one small act of unwavering love had continued long after the storm had passed, quietly changing lives one gentle encounter at a time. And somewhere beyond words, where grace often whispers instead of shouts, it seemed as though heaven had chosen to remind the world that sometimes the strongest hands wear no gloves, the bravest hearts speak no language, and the brightest light can arrive on four faithful paws, carrying nothing more than hope toward an open door.